So we've talked about active recall and we've talked about how it's the single best way to make us remember anything. But a question that students often ask is, okay, fine, active recall, like testing myself is all well and good, and I'm going to test myself more, but surely I need to learn the content first before I can test myself on it. And that's a very reasonable, claim to make. And I think there is a little bit of miscommunication, misunderstanding amongst people about what testing actually means. We think of testing as being the thing that once we've learned the stuff, then we get a test on it, and then that tests how well we've remembered the stuff, and we're sort of judged based on the performance of that test. But I think what we should start doing, and what's been really helpful for me and most of my friends, is that we start thinking of testing as just a part of the learning process itself. For example, like reading a textbook, I'm preparing for human physiology these days. At the end of every paragraph or every other paragraph, I will stop. I will sort of metaphorically close the book or look away, and I'll ask myself, okay, what have I just read? What are the key concepts from what I've just read? And can I phrase this in my own words? And I'm doing that with the book closed. I'm not wasting time by writing out a summary of stuff with the book open, because that's completely passive and completely pointless. What I'm doing is I'm closing the book and then I'm trying to actively recall what I've just read. And the fact that I'm doing it there and then also helps with the forgetting curve that, again, we've talked about a bit and we'll talk about a bit later, because as soon as I've read that paragraph, reading that paragraph is a passive process. And therefore my brain doesn't have to work very hard at reading the paragraph. Our brain is, it's not a perfect analogy, but it's sort of like a muscle, in that the harder it has to work to do something, the more likely it is to be able to do that thing better in the future. So if I've just read 2 paragraphs about how the kidneys work, that's been pretty passive. My brain hasn't had to work very hard. But if I've read those 2 paragraphs and then closed the book and then asked my brain to be like, okay, what was that I actually read? Can I remember what's going on? At that point, my brain has to work very hard. And so it's going to be more likely to strengthen that connection between all the neurons that represent the physiology of the kidneys in my mind. And therefore, I'm more likely to remember it and more likely to understand it. And at this point, I'm actually going to include wholesale a clip from a YouTube video that I made last year about how to learn new content, where I quote from the book, Make It Stick. And I will just put it in here now because I phrased it better then than I could do now. So yeah, say hello to me from the past. There's a bit at the end where the authors are showing text interviews from students that have used techniques like active recall and spaced repetition to massively boost up their marks. And there's quite a good passage where they're interviewing a medical student who got into medicine by some weird route that meant he didn't have the basic science background that all his classmates had, and he ended up being bottom of the class. And he talks in this book, towards the end, he talks about how the only way he knew how to revise, how to study stuff, was to read stuff in the book. And when he didn't understand it or when it didn't stick, he didn't know what to do, because all he'd been taught, all he'd been using for his whole life was just reading the information over and over again. And actually what he says is that when he started quizzing himself on the material as he went along, in fact, I'll read out the bit to you. He says, I would stop and think, okay, what did I just read? What is this about? I'd have to think about it. Well, I believe it happens this way. The enzyme does this and then it does that. And then I'd have to go back and check if I was way off base or on the right track. And he goes on to say, the process was not a natural fit. It makes you uncomfortable at first. If you stop and rehearse what you're reading and quiz yourself on it, it just takes a lot longer. If you have a test coming up in a week and so much to cover, then slowing down makes you pretty nervous. But the only way he knew of to cover more material, his established habit of dedicating long hours to rereading, wasn't getting the results that he needed. As hard as it was, he made himself stick to retrieval practice, active recall, long enough to at least see if it worked. And then the guy goes on to say, you just have to trust the process, and that was really the biggest hurdle for me, was getting myself to trust it. And it ended up working very well for me. Really well. By the time he started his second year, Young, the student, had pulled his grades up from the bottom of the class of 200 students to join the high performers and has remained there ever since. And then they talk about how this guy actually started mentoring students on effective study techniques and how, people started coming to him to learn how to study. This guy, who was literally bottom of his class in this medical school, coming from a background where he didn't really have any basic science knowledge, managed to get to the top to the extent that people were then asking him for help. And all he did was quiz himself on stuff as he went along. I.e. active recall, retrieval practice, testing yourself is not just for when you've learned the material, it's actually a fundamental part of learning the material in the first place. You're weaving this narrative, you're building this mental model in your head, you're telling yourself a story of your content as you're getting through it, not just, when it comes to the exam right at the end. So that was me from the past explaining about how to learn new content using active recall. And that is, I think, one of the really important parts of understanding. Because testing ourselves is really important. And honestly, if there's just one thing you take away from this entire class, I don't know how long this class is going to be, but if there's only one thing you take away from it, please let it be that we should all be testing ourselves probably 2 to 3 times as much as we currently are. But that doesn't involve just testing ourselves as a sort of judgment exercise once we've learned a topic. It involves testing ourselves throughout because, again, the more our brain has to work to do something, the more effortful the learning is, the more the connections are likely to be strengthened. So thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.